Well, hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Simon Good. I'm a professional mediator and I do training and coaching in conflict resolution skills. Today I'm talking about an interesting topic. It's tips for new graduates or younger staff, I guess, in terms of dealing with workplace conflict. Now, the way that I often approach that topic of workplace conflict when I'm doing training workshops is that it's twofold. First, we need to navigate and manage the relationships internally with other staff, with our manager, as we move into leadership positions, how to interact with our team, etc. But then on the other hand, there would also be the external facing types of relationships that would also come bundled along with some conflict. So this is stuff like how to respond to a client complaint, for example, or pushy clients. The last video I made was dealing with issues around client scope creep, for example. So we need to find a way to manage conflict. And it's interesting because I've been doing conflict resolution training now for about 4 or 5 years. And I'm just noticed that the level of feedback given is often, in my mind, quite out of proportion with the information that I'm giving. It's very, very common. Like, in fact, I would say over 75% of the workshops that I run, somebody comes up and says something along the lines of, "This has changed my life." Almost always, there's people interested in learning more. And consistently across the board, the feedback is that it's very useful. And I think the reason, I mean, obviously that sounds like a whole bunch of shameless promotion at the beginning of the video, but I have enough clients at the moment. In fact, I'm not 100% sure that I would take on board anymore for the next couple of months. So hold off if you're looking for conflict resolution skills for now. I'm not mentioning it to big note myself, although I'm sure that's how it comes across. What I've noticed is that it really does change people's lives. They often say things like, "I wish that I knew this years ago when I was new starting in my career," for example, "and I made a mess of things and I learnt a lot of painful mistakes along the way." And I suppose in reality, that is how a lot of us learn to deal with conflict. We do just muddle along and do our best, and some things work and some things don't, and it's a process of clumsy experimentation. And I think if we can think differently about conflict, like understanding the different elements involved, for example, like you can see on my channel, I've got topics around things like understanding the 5 types of conflict. So instead of assuming that all types of conflict are the same, let's look for the different factors that's driving the situation. And that then helps us to develop options for responding proactively. Strategically, I should say, although it might be a proactive approach where you can predict something that's happening and then that same set of tools can be used to plan and prepare. It might be things like assertiveness skills and finding a way to hold the line and hold on to your boundaries. Or maybe it's empathy. Maybe you're the kind of person that's already quite assertive. You're a factual, data-based, logical kind of person. And for you, what might be important is developing the soft skills to help somebody feel heard, for example, or de-escalation skills to bring down the energy in a situation. So this isn't necessarily one of the things that I'm going to be talking about, but I've noticed again and again this common theme that people come and what they wish is that earlier on in their career, they had dealt with situations differently. It might be that they just let it go and appreciated the fact that there was actually nothing they could do in that difficult situation. In fact, that was a dilemma, and in hindsight, there was no good option that they could have chosen. But in the moment, especially back then when they were younger, they were beating themselves up and ruminating about, what's wrong with me? I'm such an idiot, all that kind of stuff, or catastrophizing the consequences, or whatever the error was in terms of their overreaction, so to speak. So I've reflected on this and done my best to maybe even put together some of the themes that I've noticed in what participants share when they come and attend workshops. The first tip or bit of advice that I would give for the new graduates or new staff is to prepare for battle. And I mentioned that type of conflict, the way I think about it, happens at 2 different levels. On one hand, it's like the internal kind of stuff. And that's not like a battle like you might think of a battle when I say the word battle. Like externally, it's kind of explicit that we're pushing back, or a client might complain to try and get a refund and it's on the table, they want their money back type of thing. But internal conflict with other staff happens very differently. It's a lot more like if you've watched Game of Thrones or read a book or something about the medieval courts. And back then there was the king who was in charge, and then there was like his court, his group of advisors, and there might be religious people or academic people or whatever there. And everybody had to do this double-sided kind of fakeness, really. They had to present this image that they were 100% for the realm and would lay down their life and sacrifice everything if need be, whilst scrambling and grappling for power and backstabbing each other and doing everything that you could to influence the situation to make things better for yourself. And I think one of the things that people are often surprised of, especially early on in their career when they first deal with conflict, is that it's not a fair fight. These people will use tactics like going behind your back or lying and deception or hiding information or delaying giving you information that would be key to you succeeding in a particular option. Like if somebody's going to be out to get you, they're not going to play fair. So if you come in with this assumption that, like what your teachers have taught you growing up, like it's important to tell the truth, it's important to treat everybody how like you would be treated. Well, that's true in a sense. I do think we should prepare for reciprocity. Like if someone's generous with me, I should be generous with them. In that way, I'm going to encourage that same positive behavior back. And I might want to give 55% or 65% early on in my career. Why not? I want people around me to think that I'm valuable and to like me. So early on, my approach to conflict might be very accommodating. I'll just go with the flow and do what I can to keep the other people around me happy. But while I'm doing that, I want to focus also on developing my conflict resolution skill set because I can't endlessly be accommodating. I don't want to get 5 years into my career and still be a people pleaser that can't say no and I'm staying back late fixing mistakes that somebody else has caused or whatever it might be. So the internal war doesn't happen explicitly, it's more underground. You might have an idea in your head that you'll be able to avoid politics. I know it's almost like one of these things that we always need to pretend to be doing anyway. I just don't like to get involved in the politics, you know me. It's like, of course, mate, like none of us like to get involved in the politics. And we all pretend that we're not involved in the politics. And at exactly the same time, all of us are constantly involved in the politics. So politics has the negative connotation. What you might need to prepare for is diplomacy. And like a country ensures their safety, do you know what I mean, internationally, by having good allies or making their position clear or establishing a track record that other countries can trust you, that kind of thing. They will also be similar strategies that work for you. So internally, prepare for the diplomacy, but externally, you might be confronted by the level of conflict at the beginning. Clients can be horribly abusive and rude in the way that they speak to you. You will find that they lie and cheat and try to apply for 6 different refunds from different sections of the business, and you will come across people that threaten you physically or legally or whatever. Like, you might be surprised at some of the tactics that people use. And so for you, you might need to prepare, I think, for the external conflict to focus on self-resilience and self-care early on. It's all going to feel confronting. It's all going to feel overwhelming. So you might need to think early on about what you need to do to just keep your head above water, because that will be the worst that it gets. You might have particular challenges along the way, but as your experience grows, your confidence will build as well. The second tool or tip or I guess idea that I wanted to touch on was the way that you think about your professional development. I'll just move that mic. I'm sorry about that noise. I'm wanting to put together as many of these different free resources as possible, and part of my strategy for that's that I don't want to be editing. I'd love to know from you, would you prefer it to be edited and maybe even have slides and stuff on, and these kind of videos only come out once every month or two? Or would you prefer me to talk and prepare a rough outline, but to more or less speak from my experience and knowledge, even if it might involve a little bit more mic adjustments where I can't edit it out? What do you think down below? So I love the idea that Robert Greene puts forward about treating particular stages in your career like apprenticeships, moving into a different role the first time that you become team leader. Early on in your career, it might just be your starting work full stop. And you're not going to get everything right early on. It's going to feel overwhelming. You will probably feel like everybody else knows what they're doing and you don't, and maybe even that there's something wrong with you and everyone's looking at you. 100%, I can tell you that it is way bigger in your head. People are not focusing on you as much as they think that you are. And any possible consequence, like losing your job at this stage, won't be as bad as you think that it is. You'll be able to bounce back. But in the moment, it does feel like everything's at stake. And I guess that is all we've got if it's our first job and we're almost going to lose it, or we're worried that we might lose it. It feels really scary. So, one of the ways I think that we can almost help ourselves manage this early apprenticeship way of thinking is to follow the steps that Robert Greene outlines in his books like Mastery. So, initially, he talks about just observing, like watching what other people do and what they say. Now, in terms of conflict, you might notice what they say to do as well as what they actually do. And they are often two different things. You might have a team leader that talks a lot about collaborative leadership, for example, and they use those phrases and they might even use it to justify decisions that they make. But they're not collaborative. They're not leading in a collaborative kind of way. It's almost, I think it's the same way politicians do. They often accuse the other side of doing the very thing that they do. So pay attention to the different layers that are involved, even the way that they interact with like their boss, for example, or with other managers that are at the same level as them. You can learn a lot about what's expected, what the norms are, different options for dealing with situations. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll copy them, but you might prepare, for example, how you would manage someone taking the tactic that they're using in this meeting. You know, the way they interrupt this person or talk over the top of them, or they allowed some silence before they responded to build a little bit of tension and really bring focus to their reply. You know, what did they do and what effect did it have? And the reason that observing works early on is because it doesn't cost you anything. You're not risking anything by messing it up. I think some people come in, like I did, to be honest. I was a bit of a know-it-all and thought that I was going to be an absolute legend. And I mean, I always was. This is another thing that sounds stupidly arrogant, but you know, my early career, I did get promoted and stuff very early, and I was a high performer in some of the different metrics we were using. But gosh, I experienced so much anxiety and stress along the way. Like I would be the one that spoke up, and I would have my colleagues come to me after a meeting and say, "Thank you, like we're really glad you put forward that view. That's really important from our perspective." And in hindsight, I didn't realize that this was like the Game of Thrones stuff going on. Like they were leading me out like a lamb to be slaughtered and sort of pushing their agenda forward, if you know what I mean. But I'm Mr. Ego. I want to be admired and think that I'm a legend. When they come up and said, "That was really great that you spoke up on behalf of the rest of the team," then I was like, yeah, that's my role. That's how I'm going to contribute, etc. Not realizing the ways that that might have even been limiting my career. Like, honestly, I think if I had have learnt to play ball and just go along with the flow a little bit and be more accommodating instead of competing and being stubborn or constantly looking at the win-win option, just let them have what they want. Like, do what your boss is asking for, even if it's illogical or irrational. I just couldn't get it together. And in hindsight, I wish that I just watched and observed first before making so many, to be honest, quite painful and embarrassing mistakes along the way. Like, really embarrassing, like the kind of memories that, you know, I can almost feel my cheeks starting to get a little bit flushed thinking about some of the, ways that I quit jobs in just such a level of emotional distress, rather than taking a few minutes to calm myself down before a conversation, for example. So just observe. The second step that you'll do is to try what they do and give it a go. You don't need to come up with, like, reinvent the wheel, so to speak. Just use the phrases, ask for advice, ask your colleagues for what they would do, get feedback from people, but start experimenting. And then the third step is when you start to bring your own element to it, like a creative thing. Like, you might ask the kind of question or use a different posture or try pausing when other people wouldn't normally do it, or suggest that something's followed up with a written record instead of just a verbal conversation. Once you start to experiment, I think that's the point where we really are moving on that trajectory towards mastery. And if we can master conflict, man, it is a superpower. If you can calm people down more quickly or get more buy-in from your staff around the decision that you've made, it just makes your life so much easier. Even your personal life, like relationships or parenting challenges, it just takes the edge off some of those otherwise. It's the kind of drama that we just get ourselves stuck in when we lose it and we haven't had enough sleep or we're not thinking very clearly. Until I've had a few of those moments over the past couple of weeks, I think. So it's obviously quite relevant for me at the moment, with an 8-year-old. And I'm considering starting a podcast called Calm Down Dad, which is just tips for dads. Because I think, honestly, we're probably, unfortunately, infecting our kids with the same level of reactivity that our parents responded to us with. That's what I blame it on. It's all my parents' fault, right? So the third tip, or the third idea, the third point I wanted to make was to look out for self protective mechanisms, especially when we're thinking about workplace conflict. These are things like alcohol, drinking, drugs, porn, shopping, online shopping, food, like chocolate bars, gambling, the horse races, gambling on sports, binging particular types of media, getting engaged in online conflict. I think that's the other part of it. Sometimes the addiction shows up more. It's like the thrill of the chase. We feel uneasy and we feel a little bit more settled when we're pursuing something. So, looking for exactly the right piece of recording gear you want to record, for example. Like, I don't know how many hours I spent looking at reviews of these types of microphones. And I mean, they probably all sound equally crap at the end of the day anyway, because I didn't learn the technique, which would have been a far better use of those many, many hours rather than microphone reviews, right? So be a little bit careful about the self protective mechanisms that you're developing when conflict gets bad, because it's very stressful. You'll have an increase in cortisol, which stays in our system for up to 18 hours. So you go home after workplace conflict and you're feeling on edge, you feel worked up, and your brain is looking to put things back in balance, achieve homeostasis. And it might be those beautiful cold beers that are in the fridge, or that delicious chocolate bar as you're placing the online groceries order, or flicking endlessly through Tinder or something like that. Or I don't know, endlessly planning for something that's already been planned, or practicing, or obsessions, that kind of stuff. And you might also notice the way other people are dealing with conflict too. Like, you might have a boss that you really respect, but you could notice the fact that maybe they drink far more than is healthy for them. And although that might be something that you could engage in when you're young and it's not such a big deal, and the hangovers aren't as painful as they will be when you're in your 40s, we're setting ourselves up both in terms of the health foundation that we're building in our body, the patterns in our brain, though, and our habits. So, what does your brain expect when it experiences stress? Well, if you've just been through a lot of stress and there's not usually this flood of beer immediately afterwards, then your brain might learn to regulate itself. But if you're constantly putting the band-aid on and having 3 beers before you've done some deep breathing or meditation or done anything else to change how you're feeling, it's the beer, well, that's going to become the automatic process for you. And your subconscious reaction might even be to walk to the fridge and grab a drink out before you've even thought about it. So they make sense in the moment, these self protective ideas. Every time I run a stress management training workshop, people say drinking is my go to stress management strategy. Or they say wine, and I say, is it the WHINE or the WINE version of wine? Because one tends to be more helpful than the other, although they're probably both a net negative if we think about it. It doesn't matter if you do that once or twice, your body can recover, but you really need to be careful about these habits and patterns that develop. So if you are developing them, I think the book Atomic Habits is a really good practical framework for reducing those addictive and negative behaviors. And if that's even something that you'd be interested in me talking a little bit about, I'd be happy to talk, particularly around conflict, like what are some helpful self-care and self-protective strategies versus some of the more automatic reactions that we might be drawn to. So the final point that I wanted to make, the fourth big, I guess, idea that I've written down is, for younger people, you should think about conflict in terms of the opportunity to learn about yourself. And I say should, like I almost never give advice. I usually say, like, think about this as a question. But I honestly do believe that when we're involved in conflict, and the reason that I think relationships are so important for us, or one of the reasons, is that it reveals ourselves to us in other people, the values that we have, the like when I'm feeling a strong emotion, I often look at that as a signal that a boundary is being crossed, or there's something at stake here, or one of my values is being activated, so to speak. I'm not thinking about energy fields and all that kind of stuff, but there is a cellular level where there's energy transition, and it's very similar to an electrical signal like the internet in terms of what's happening in your brain. So there is this vibe that comes and goes when we're in conflict with people, and we pick up on the energy from them and we get to affect them. But I think ultimately it's a chance to figure out what's important to you, how you want to treat people. And especially early on, like I've said, it is often showing you the worst bits of yourself, the bits of you that are still very raw. If you're still a very reactive kind of person, or you tend to overthink things, or you're a bit of a perfectionist, or you might be a procrastinator, conflict often turns up the dial on all of those things. And so, what it's doing, I think, is often unearthing both the negative and the worst of us and the best of us, if you know what I mean. And the way that we improve in conflict, it's a little bit like an inchworm crawling along. Sometimes we're stretching out our nose and the best that we get becomes better. Like we really nail a difficult conversation, or we get a response back from a client that's better than we expected. But sometimes it's the other end. It's that we're not making as many mistakes as we used to, or when we make a mistake, we're getting better at getting ourselves out of trouble. So think about the way that you develop conflict as both showing you very deep things about yourself, but it's also teaching you about the world. The strategies that we use in conflict often translate into, like I've said, parenting or dating and marriages or other family relationships that you've got. So if you can learn how to regulate your nervous system at work, of course, that's also helpful when you've trodden on a bit of Lego and your kids, not had a shower and it's past bedtime and you've asked them 17 times and everything else. For me, I started my career as a mediator working in the family and divorce and separation kind of sector. So I became accredited as something called a family dispute resolution practitioner in Australia, which is such a dumb name. There's politicians that come up with these. I honestly think that might be a deliberately chosen name to be as least clear as possible. Family dispute resolution practitioner. Hey guys, we have a word called mediator. Like, why not just call it family mediator? Or I don't know. It's just anyway. That's what I was. FDRP was the acronym that we used, and no one knew what it meant. But people would go and see their lawyer to get a divorce, and here they got told you have to go and see an FDRP. So I was a mediator, meeting these people at the early stages of divorce and separation. So, I can remember I was talking to my friend who's a criminal lawyer who lives nearby when we moved in. And I said to him, like, how do you find it? That must be pretty intense work dealing with criminals all day. Here's my naive, not having much exposure to that type of stuff worldview. And he said, no, because I see bad people on their best day. But you, and he's talking about me, or the divorce lawyers that he knew, see good people on their worst day. And he said, I think that I know which one I would prefer. So I didn't recognize at the time, like I was being thrown into the furnace here. And it wasn't just people separating. I actually was working with court-ordered clients. So the very pointy end of the stick of extremely high conflict and very often family violence and mental health issues and all this kind of stuff. And I've had my own just terrible experiences of conflict with bullying inept bosses and all this kind of stuff. And I wish at the time I'd calibrated my thinking to accept the difficulty. Like, it's just as bad as it feels like it is. Like, that's my signal to myself. But it was letting me know I needed more knowledge, or I needed to prepare for these appointments differently, or I needed to manage my afternoons after work differently, or I needed some different kind of support, or maybe this wasn't the right role for me, or I should make an adjustment, or look at this different credential, or all that kind of stuff. It's like the signals can be there. I'm not saying that you necessarily need to ignore them. You pay attention to them. But what they're telling you is it's like feedback for calibration. When we can process the reciprocal patterns that are involved in these types of things, especially when it's conflict. Like when they said that, what did you say next? What facial expression did you use? How did the meeting start? What did you say when you walked in? How were you sitting or standing? How were you dressed? Like, think about all of this kind of stuff because it matters. And in those apprentice stages, the observe and copy and then experiment, like copy the way that they dress. Like, I've experimented wearing ties to work for a long time and wearing more formal kind of clothes, or more rich, affluent kind of clothes, like a nice watch, or, an Apple Watch. And what difference does that make in terms of the way that my team perceives me or not? It's probably not much. But what I'm wanting to do is to approach these situations with an open perspective. It's not that I actually want to diagnose and figure out specifically what's going on. When I come to conflict with this very open view that this is an opportunity to learn, it then means that when things go wrong or there's a problem or my voice wavers a little bit when I'm feeling nervous or my hands shake or my face goes red or something, it's like I can take it in my stride because this is a learning opportunity and this is a really valuable experience for me to have right now. And this is going to translate into something else that's valuable for me, whether that's you want to have a successful career, or you might want to be a supportive team member and look after your team and colleagues, or a supportive manager. Well, that's also motivation for you to almost want to go through conflict and experience those uncomfortable experiences because that's where you'll be learning the most. The blade is sharpened through friction. And I think our conflict resolution skills are very similar. And when we can frame things in that way, if you're an anxious, neurotic kind of person like I am, I think it often means that instead of feeling trapped and overwhelmed and helpless and hopeless, all of a sudden it means that I don't need to know all of the answers right now. If I can just pause and approach this with this open mindset and, okay, I don't know everything right now. So the next little while for me will be reflecting and thinking about options and let me just see what comes to mind over the next day or two. I've lowered the stakes. I've increased my level of self-efficacy, like my perceived ability to influence the situation. And it means that even if things are stuck, quote unquote, at the moment, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm sitting here feeling stuck and overwhelmed to the same extent. I wonder if that resonates with you and if that's something that you've experienced, that rumination and intrusive thoughts, particularly around conflict. It's a very common, I think, experience for people to have. So you're not a purely rational kind of person. You know what I mean? Like, I think some people think about conflict and, well, professional development, continuous learning, continuous improvement's really important to me. Yeah, fantastic. Good on you. Here's the little gold star on your chest. But you're not just a purely logical, rational kind of person. We've also got other aspects of us, yourself. So even in terms of that conflict is an opportunity to develop, there's the rational, logical bit, like I want to improve my knowledge, but there's the emotional part as well. Like maybe I want to get better at regulating my emotional reaction to situations, not displaying negative emotions, picking up and being more insightful or intuitive about the emotions that other people are displaying, for example. It might be physiologically, like I'm aware that when I haven't eaten something or I'm hungover, I'm different. I'm not dealing with conflict well. So conflict affects us, and there's this reciprocal pattern around our body as well, our physical self. Conflict affects our perception, and so as you're developing your conflict skills, your perception will also adjust, and maybe you're able to take that more open-ended approach or think about a difficult situation from that perspective of being in the helicopter looking down, and there's a little bit of distance and differentiation that you're able to create from the emotional engagement that's happening in the issue. Or maybe it's your volition, your ability to regulate your own behavior. Like self-control improves, that early on in your career when somebody said something that pushed your buttons, you couldn't resist jumping in and correcting them. And then through experience, especially if you've engaged in this as a proactive, deliberate, reflective practice, it often means that you develop better self-control so that when someone says something, that subconscious automatic reaction of, that's not true or easy for you to say or whatever it is that we want to, get them back with. It's like, whatever, I can either just let that go, or I can choose a little bit more strategically which words that I'll use, or the tone of voice might be a little bit more confident and assertive rather than steaming a little bit more like I'm at the end of my tether myself. So those are the 4 big ideas that resonated for me, and particularly as I've noticed other themes that come out from people. Prepare for battle. Think about that analogy of the olden days of court and the Game of Thrones, especially for the internal types of conflict, but don't be surprised if you get some overt external types of wars with clients and other stakeholders as well. Early on, maybe think about conflict like that apprenticeship, to observe, to take on board from other people, to borrow, and then to experiment. Watch out for your self-protective and self-care mechanisms and make sure that you're not building negative habits. And then think about conflict, generally speaking, as that opportunity to learn and to build, really, I think, a pretty important skill set that you'll use later on in your career and other aspects of your life as well. Well, if it's been useful for you, I'd really appreciate it if you'd be willing to press like. It's incredibly useful for a tiny little channel like this as a cue to the algorithm that other people might find it useful. And if you're not already subscribed and you would like other free resources for dealing with conflict, whether it's workplace conflict or other kinds of relationships that you're dealing with, please consider pressing subscribe. And if there's a particular question or a topic that you'd like me to cover in a future video, put it into the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.